Good evening, and welcome back to Bibliotherapy Live with me talking tonight about gardens in literature, which is a rich and wonderfully fecund topic. I'm going to be talking about gardens in literature from the Garden of Eden in the Bible to the Garden of Evening Mists by Tan Tuen Eng. Gardens have provided authors opportunities for backdrops against which assignations, spying, buffoonery, and the unexpected can occur. They're perfect opportunities for many strange and wonderful things to happen. And in the world of fiction, gardens are one of the best places to go for authors. From Homer to Hilary Mantel, great authors have conjured gardens rather, to capture lovers, betray secrets, and allow people to grow old in. So tonight I'm going to explore a few of these wonderful gardens, and I will touch on some non-fiction too, but I know I won't have time to mention nearly as many as I'd like, and I'd love you to tell me your thoughts on which gardens you have loved particularly in literature. Hi Colleen, it's great to see you here once again. And thanks for coming. And I wonder if you have any particular gardens that you love. I'm going to start by going back to the time of Homer. Where better to start, some would say, in the world of literature, in the Odyssey, where Calypso, the sea nymph's garden, was a place of powerful, seducing sexuality. And I'll read you a little bit in translation, obviously, from the Odyssey, which describes Calypso's garden. It goes, he, Hermes, found her, Calypso, within. A great fire was burning in the hearth, and from afar, over the isle, there was a fragrance of cleft cedar and juniper as they burned. But she was singing with a sweet voice as she went to and fro before the loom. Why is it that people are always weaving in ancient literature? Weaving with a golden shuttle. Round about the cave grew a luxuriant wood, alder and poplar and sweet-smelling cypress, wherein birds long of wing were wont to nest, owls and falcons and sea crows with chattering tongues, who ply their business by the sea. And right there about the hollow cave ran trailing a garden vine, in pride of its prime, richly laden with clusters. And fountains four in a row were flowing with bright water hard by one another, turned one this way, one that, and round about soft meadows of violets and parsley were blooming. So that is a fecund garden, if ever I heard of one, and that's Calypso's garden on the island where she lived and where Odysseus washed up. And she then kept him, I think it was for 9 years, which is pretty impressive to keep someone who's meant to be on their way home to their wife. Calypso was quite a naughty nymph, it seems, and her garden worked its powers on Odysseus and kept him enchanted and in love with Calypso until Hermes came along and told her that it was time that Odysseus had to leave. So that's one of the earliest gardens that we have in literature. But Chaucer was also a great one for writing quite often raunchy scenes in his many tales, the Canterbury Tales. He did have in his tales more erudite and uplifting kinds of gardens too. For instance, in The Knight's Tale, he had very formal gardens where lovers walked and held hands and were just giving each other's flowers and being very noble and aristocratic. But in The Merchant's Tale, the married couple January and May have some rather entertaining dalliances. because January is an old man who has married May, who's in her 20s, and he very frankly has just married her in order to be able to have as much recreational sex as he can. May is not necessarily thrilled, but is happy to marry him for his money. And I'm just going to describe his garden in Chaucer's words. So forgive my slightly strange Chaucerian accent. In his garden are no wight but they tway, that in a morrow unto his May saith he, rise up, my wife, my love, my lady free. The turtle's voice is heard, my dove sweet. The winter is goon with all his rains wheat. Come forth now with thine iron columbine. How fairer between thy breasts than is wine. The garden is enclosed all about. Come forth, my white spouse, out of doubt. Thou hast me wounded in my heart, O wife. No spot of thee, nay, knew I all my life. Come forth and let us taken our disport. I cheese thee for my wife and my comfort. So that's actually quite a non-risque part of the story, but we do get involved in some arboreal sex during this excellent tale when May disports herself with another lover and actually is noticed by January in her adulterous affair. And it's very funny and very raunchy, which when I first studied English literature in Cambridge back in the day, I had no idea that Chaucer was such a raunchy writer. But it is a very entertaining story. So even Chaucer likes to get down and dirty in the garden. But moving on, I've seen a question saying, what kind of thing are you after? And I would say that for what I'm interested in your favourite literary gardens are the ones that you remember the most. And I'm going to be telling you about an array of my favourites, which will probably give you suggestions, hopefully. So before I move on to more grown-up books, and by the way, it's great to see Ollie here as well this evening. And maybe, Ollie, you might have some different ideas about gardens in literature coming from Tel Aviv. So I'm just going to mention a couple of children's books because children's books are, of course, full of wonderful gardens. And one of the most wonderful and most memorable is Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pearce. I have a very old copy here. And this is a story about a boy who is in quarantine because his brother's got measles. So a familiar topic, quarantine. And he has to go and stay with his very boring uncle and aunt in their urban apartment. And he's really sad because he wanted to spend all his summer building a treehouse in his back garden. And actually now he's got to go and stay in a flat which has no garden. But he is lucky enough that the first night that he stays there with his boring uncle and aunt, he wakes up on the strike of 13 when the clock strikes 13 in their flat. And he goes downstairs, opens their back door, and there is a magical garden, which was definitely not there in the daytime because that's meant to be the street. He then walks out into that garden and meets a ghost who is a girl called Hattie. And I won't tell you what happens, but it's a sort of time traveling book. And the boy, Tom, keeps going into the garden every night. And in the daytime, it's not there. And it's a very, very magical, beautiful, lovely book and totally set in the garden. So the garden itself is a key character. And it does refer to a real garden that used to exist. There is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which I won't talk about in detail tonight because I have mentioned it before in other bibliotherapy sessions because it's such a wonderfully therapeutic book full of hope and optimism and green shoots and a secret garden. And who doesn't love a secret garden? But I strongly recommend you read that to anyone that hasn't. Another really lovely children's book is The Night Gardener by Terry and Eric Fan from Ontario in Canada. They're the Fan brothers, two brothers, one of whom writes the books and the other illustrates them. And they're amazingly beautifully illustrated, really lovely books. And this one is about a man who goes out into the gardens every night and creates wonderful topiary and does amazing things to people's gardens when they're all asleep. So that's a really fantastic summer lovely children's book. But I don't want to dwell too much on children's books. I'm going to move on to the more adult novels in which gardens play significant roles. One of them I must just mention also is L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, which I did talk about last week when I was doing a bibliotherapy session on my Facebook page, which was all about hot summer love. And The Go-Between is one of my absolute favourite all-time novels, but it's got the most intense garden scene that I've ever experienced in literature, which involves a deadly nightshade and lovers who are caught and betrayed in the garden. And it's an agonizingly painful scene, but it's also an absolutely brilliant book, which takes place in a heat wave. And it's one that I would very thoroughly recommend. And it pretty much all takes place in a garden. So that's one of my favorite garden books ever. We must also mention the fact that many a murder takes place in a novel, in literature. And Agatha Christie, of course, has a lot of excellent novels which have murders taking place in the garden or near murders, people listening to each other behind the bushes, accidentally throwing marrows over the edge of a fence and nearly killing someone with the marrow, investigating people while sipping tea in the garden and remaining unobserved. So Agatha Christie is a great one for finding evil, nefarious activities taking place in gardens. But I'd like to dwell briefly also on Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, which was written in 1945. And for people that haven't read it, it has a very wonderful aristocratic and formal garden, which is part of a kind of stately home owned by the key family of the book, who are called the Flights. And the story revolves around Sebastian Flight and his relationship with his best friend, whether it's a gay love affair or a very intense friendship is never made completely clear, but it's one of the most intense and powerful friendships in literature, and a huge amount of the book actually takes place in gardens, whether it's in Brideshead, the aristocratic home of the family, or whether it's also in the Botanical Gardens of Oxford, which is where the two students are together at university. And the book takes place between 1920 and 1940. It's a story very much about the effects of war on both ordinary people and the super rich aristocratic class. And it's also very much about the fate of the house itself, which at one point is requisitioned by the army. And I'll just read you a little quote from Brideshead, which gives you a flavour of the writing. "But I was in search of love in those days, and I went full of curiosity and the faint, unrecognised apprehension that here, at last, I should find that low door in the wall, which others, I knew, had found before me, which opened on an enclosed and enchanted garden, which was somewhere not overlooked by any window in the heart of that grey city." So there he's talking about the botanical gardens in Oxford and how he's hoping to find that low door in the wall. But he's also very much talking about the garden as a metaphor for finding love and excitement and the mysterious, unnameable joys of manhood. So, Brideshead, it's a book full of an amazing sense of nostalgia, pain, sadness, and it's also quite a religious book, but it does have a lot of fantastic garden action too. So gardens are not just European by any means, obviously. There's a lot of amazing gardens in worldwide literature. So moving on from Brideshead, I would love to mention another fantastic and far more recent book, which is The Garden of Evening Mists by Tan Tuan Eng, which was published in 2016, I believe, which is a Malaysian novel, published 2012, which centres on a judge, a female judge, who is a very accomplished woman who's risen above a traumatic past, which included time being a Japanese prisoner of war in World War II. And she served as an apprentice to a gardener before then finding a prominent position in the law. So it's a complex narrative which is split between three periods, the 1980s, the 1950s, and the war itself. And we do see some of the moments of torture and horror that happened to her as a Japanese prisoner of war. But one of the things which I feel is particularly pertinent to gardens in literature as bibliotherapy is the fact that she talks about how when she was actually a prisoner of war being tortured, how she and her sister escaped into make-believe worlds, which were worlds of gardens. So to give you the exact quote, she says, Yun Hang, which is the sister of the narrator, Yun Hang's love of gardens kept us alive. How did it keep you alive? Asks the interlocutor. We escaped into make-believe worlds, I said. Some imagined themselves building the house of their dreams or constructing a yacht. The more details they could include, the better they were insulated from the horrors around them. I withdrew from the other prisoners, preferring to lose myself in my own thoughts. To distract myself, I created a garden in my mind, calling it up from nothing more than memory. And she does say that when a guard beat her, she withdrew into her imagined garden and could smell the flowers and actually visualize the colors of the flowers as well. And this is something that all of us can do when we escape into literature. And it's one of the things that I talk about as a bibliotherapist, that if you can memorize passages from books or memorize a story in great detail, then when you have times of stress and trouble and you might not be able to be reading, you might be unable to do anything but think, then escaping into that mental space, being able to go back to a passage that you've learned off by heart, or escaping into the mental space of a book that you've read, which could be something like The Secret Garden or The Go-Between or The Chamomile Lawn, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute. That is a wonderful asset to have. So I'm a big proponent of learning literature off by heart. And if you don't want to learn actual passages, then just learning the bones of the story and the ideas of the story and visualizing them is a really wonderful thing to do. So The Chamomile Lawn by Mary Wesley is a very popular and wondrous book, which is set in Cornwall. It was written in the 1980s and it describes the fates of five cousins who are all growing up from around 1930 up to 1980. And it's called the Chamomile Lawn because in their family home, they have a lawn going down to the sea, which is a chamomile lawn. And around this setting, the cousins have many interesting adventures which are all about love, betrayal, and even murder. And it starts with a party during the summer when the cousins want to do something that they call the terror run, which is when they all, for fun, run around the cliff edge in the moonlight in the middle of the night, which one might say is risking their lives. But apparently it's very safe and they know what they're doing. But maybe they don't. And maybe also they might be playing something else later to be called the murder game. So this is a book which actually appears to be quite a gentle, lovely book set in an English country garden. But actually, there's quite a lot of darkness lurking beneath. And it's a book that I really recommend to you, and which the garden plays a central theme, although the characters actually moved to London as well. So it's not all set in the Garden of Cornwall. Just going to have a little drink. I hope that some of you might be joining me for a Pimm's this evening and channeling vibes of hot summer evenings, which I'm sure will come again. There's another darker kind of book which I would love to bring to your attention, which is The Blind Man's Garden by Nadim Aslam, which is a very heartfelt, quite painful at times to read book written by the Pakistani author Nadim Aslam, who also wrote Maps for Lost Lovers, for which he received great acclaim. And this is a book which has a very important garden. So the blind man, who is the eponymous hero in a way of the book, but it's his sons who are equally important, has a garden where he ends up keeping snares for birds, not through any will of his own, but near the beginning of the book, a man asks him if he can set snares for his birds in the trees of the blind man's garden. He calls it harmless captivity because his job is the man that asks, the old man, is to go round the city where they live with a cage full of birds, which he asks anyone that encounters him to pay him to release. And he's known as the bird pardoner. And supposedly the freed bird says a prayer on behalf of the person who's bought its freedom. And the narrator of the book conjectures whether the more beautiful and exotic the bird, perhaps the greater a prayer is said and the more can be forgiven. So it's quite a strange and sinister idea which the blind man allows to happen. And there are many scenes in the book where we see the birds trapped in the trees and they are fighting for their lives and squawking with terror. And it's quite a trying thing to witness mentally. But the metaphor in this book is all about the buying and selling of freedom, which is one of the main threads of the book. And it's all about people being trapped in Afghanistan. It's about I forgot to say that it's all post 9/11, and it's set in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and it relates to young men who are forced to join the Taliban. So it's very much about freedom as a concept, freedom of the Americans, freedom of the Afghanistani people, people who are imprisoned. And there's also a snow leopard that wanders around the novel freely, in stark contrast to the birds and the people who've been trapped. And also horses hidden underground that suddenly burst through the earth. So it's a book, although it is in some ways quite a depressing read. It's amazingly beautifully written, and it has a lot of wonderful imagery all about nature. So thoroughly recommend that. Moving on to something rather more light and gentle and gorgeous, The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim is a book which I must admit, very frequently suggest to people to read when I do bibliotherapy sessions with them, because it's just such a lovely book all about a garden in Italy where four ladies go kind of unexpectedly in one very wet British April. So the novel starts with two women in Hampstead feeling really sorry for themselves, looking at the rain and thinking, surely we can't sit in this rain for the rest of our lives. And they slightly spontaneously reply to an advert for going to a castle in Italy where there will be wisteria and sunshine. And they then set off on that journey together without their husbands. So the book is all about these two ladies' freedom and how they have a kind of metamorphosis when they reach the garden in Italy. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from it, because Elizabeth von Arnim is such a wonderful writer about gardens. She was actually famous for her gardens herself, and she wrote a semi-autobiographical novel which was called Elizabeth and Her German Garden in 1898, which is actually a similarly beautiful, evocative and lovely book. But she's not just brilliant about writing about gardens, she's also really quite sharp and sometimes quite waspish in her humour. So she's quite sharp in some ways. So I'll just read you a little bit from this book. Yet the four visitors, while their bodies sat, that was Mrs. Fisher's, or lay, that was Lady Caroline's, or loitered, that was Mrs. Arbuthnot's, or went in solitude up into the hills, that was Mrs. Wilkins, were anything but torpid, really. Their minds were unusually busy. Even at night, their minds were busy, and the dreams they had were clear, thin, quick things, entirely different from the heavy dreams of home. There was that in the atmosphere of San Salvatore which produced active-mindedness in all except the natives. They, as before, whatever the beauty around them, whatever the prodigal seasons did, remained immune from thoughts other than those they were accustomed to. All their lives they had seen, year by year, the amazing recurrent spectacle of April in the gardens, and custom had made it invisible to them. They were as blind to it, as unconscious of it, as Domenico's dog asleep in the sun. That's the gardener's dog. The visitors could not be blind to it. It was too arresting after London in a particularly wet and gloomy March. Suddenly to be transported to that place where the air was so still that it held its breath, where the light was so golden that the most ordinary things were transfigured, to be transported into that delicate warmth, that caressing fragrance, and to have the old grey castle as the setting, and in the distance the serene, clear hills of Perugini's backgrounds, was an astonishing contrast. Even Lady Caroline, used all her life to beauty, who'd been everywhere and seen everything, felt the surprise of it. It was that year a particularly wonderful spring, and all of the months at San Salvatore, April, if the weather was fine, was best. May scorched and withered, March was restless and could be hard and cold in its brightness, but April came along softly, like a blessing, and if it were a fine April, it was so beautiful that it was impossible not to feel different, not to feel stirred and touched. So that describes the slow awakening of the four ladies who end up in that wonderful garden at San Salvatore. It starts off as two, and then two more join in so as to afford the surprisingly low rent of the castle. But it is a magical book which is a pure delight, and I wholly recommend it. And if you do enjoy that, you should definitely also read Elizabeth and Her German Garden, which does have one of my favourite quotes. Oh, my dear, relations are like drugs, useful sometimes and even pleasant if taken in small quantities, and seldom but dreadfully pernicious on the whole, and the truly wise avoid them. Obviously, I don't mean that to any relatives that are watching me. I love you all. But I do love the way that von Arnim has quite a little waspish sense of humour sometimes. So another book I would love to mention also with a very important garden is Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which is a Nigerian novel in which the 15-year-old narrator of the story is trapped in a kind of compound with her very, very strict father. And she also lives with her brother. And they both have a very difficult childhood where everything is highly regulated and highly flattened by his abusive behavior. And the symbol for the possible freedom that they could attain becomes the purple hibiscus, which grows in their Auntie Ifeoma's garden. And it's a wonderful symbol of freedom because not only is it a beautiful flower that's a hibiscus, which is a wonderful exotic plant, but it's also something that is created because hibiscus aren't usually purple. They're usually pink, yellow, white. Purple's pretty unusual. And the brother, Jar Jar, of the heroine, who's called Kimbili, sees this purple hibiscus as a symbol of freedom for which he can strive. And because this purple hibiscus exists, he does begin to strive to escape the mental and physical bonds that his father puts on him. So purple hibiscus, that's a very different kind of garden to the Enchanted April and a garden such as in the Go-Between, because it's a very hot, exotic, tropical garden, but it is a really fantastic and wonderful book, which I completely urge you to read. There's a book I feel I must mention too, which is The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway, if only for its title, and because the Garden of Eden itself comes into so much of literature from the Bible. It's been extrapolated and echoed and mirrored in hundreds of books. And Hemingway's Garden of Eden is a really interesting book, not least because it was published posthumously. It was one of some writings that he left which had not been finished. So it does have a bit of controversy around it because it's not necessarily completely as he intended. But The Garden of Eden by Hemingway is a giant metaphor for unhappiness in love, really, and different ways that evil can come into people's relationships. It's about a husband and wife, and the husband always refers to his wife as devil, which could be a bit of a clue to the reference to the Garden of Eden metaphor there. And he also brings in another woman who joins in the relationship, which also involves a lot of interesting androgynous roles because the wife in the novel decides that she wants to look like a boy, so she cuts her hair really short, and then the husband, she urges her husband to do the same thing, and so they both look kind of identical, and then they both take on this other lady as a lover, and you wonder which one might be the snake if we're looking at that Garden of Eden metaphor fully. And it is a really interesting read, which typically of Hemingway seems extremely simple, but bears a lot of rereading and pondering. And going from such a enormously American white male author to a slightly different extreme, I would love to mention a great crime novel, which I know some of you would really enjoy, called The Girls in the Garden by Lisa Jewell, which is set in a beautiful, picturesque garden in London. Well, it's not all set there, but that's where the first scene begins, where it's a kind of communal garden square, a kind of oasis in an urban setting where the children run free and everyone's friends, all the neighbours know each other, and people often have barbecues and hang out in the summer, and everyone trusts each other and knows each other well, so they think. But then something bad happens, and one of the girls seems to have been molested, and something awful has happened to her in that garden. And it's then a story about how that community comes unraveled, and it is a real page turner. So that's more of a dark side of gardens, but it's definitely a really great read, and it is a midsummer story, so a good one to read now. So I'd also love to talk a little bit about a couple of non-fiction books which I have to hand somewhere, just looking for them now, which are recent books about gardens. Now, this one, Wilding by Isabella Tree, is a really beautiful read, beautifully written. Sorry, I've got a bit of a shine going on there, which is all about the Knepp estate in Sussex. That's Knepp, which is a real estate, which is actually not far from where I live. It's near East Grinstead, and it's an estate which dates back to, I think, the 11th century. And Isabella Tree and her husband took over the estate as a farm initially, and they wanted to try and make it into a viable farm, but they slowly realized that this wasn't going to work, and they took a very bold step in 2001 of deciding to turn it into a wild estate where people could actually go back and rewild themselves. Thanks, Heather. You love wilding, and you must have read it too. And it is an incredibly inspiring book, and it really makes you want to go to the Knepp estate and see it for yourself. But it's a book which is incredibly passionate about bringing back wildlife, and letting nature take its course. It's got fantastic pictures of the estate itself too, which I'm just trying to flick through to find you the loveliest ones. There's also lovely pictures of the mammals that have been brought back to live in the estate. Oh yes, here's a lovely one which shows you just how glorious it is. And the book is all about the passion of bringing the wildlife that's been destroyed really by farming back into the British countryside. And considering that they started this project in 2001, and it was a really groundbreaking approach, it has succeeded incredibly well. So now you can go and visit, and apparently there are swarms of butterflies, amazing birds of prey that are almost never seen except for in places like Scotland, the wild boar, which I showed you a picture of, and you can go and camp there, you can go and experience the nature for yourself, and it makes you want to try and let that happen throughout the land. And it's not just a mad project as well. Isabella Tree actually has a lot of information about how we could allow ourselves to let far more of our countryside go wild, and we don't need to farm it to the absolute death of the soil. And it's really interesting because it gives you a lot of history about how farming has worked over the last few hundred years, the mistakes we've made, and hopefully the ways that we could go in the future. So I would very much recommend that as an incredibly inspiring garden read. Then also, another bit of non-fiction is this really lovely book, The Well Gardened Mind, Rediscovering Nature in the Modern World by Sue Stuart-Smith, which is a book about the psychology of gardens and why we might gain a huge amount of positivity and mental well-being from gardening. She says it's been estimated that for every pound spent by the NHS on gardening projects, £5 can be saved in reduced health costs. Gardening brings together the emotional, physical, social, vocational, and spiritual aspects of life, boosting people's mood and self-esteem. So she has many different chapters about different aspects of gardening and how it helps your mental health. But it's goes all around the world. So it's not just talking about gardening in Europe. It also talks about places like Papua New Guinea, where the islanders have a long tradition of fishing, but they are first and foremost gardeners, according to Sue Stuart-Smith, who's quoting a writer called Malinowski here. And she says that although it was the men who took the lead, families would garden together, and Malinowski observed the joy they took in delving into the earth, in turning it up, planting the seed, watching the plants grow, mature, and yield the harvest. Community life revolved around the gardens, which, as a collective source of pride and ambition, gave rise to a surprising care for the aesthetics of gardening. Although the Trobriand people, who are the ones that live in Papua New Guinea, were knowledgeable horticulturalists, no amount of skill was considered enough to ensure that plants would grow well. Magic was essential to a garden's productivity. Each village had a head man, or Tawosi, who was also the garden wizard. The Tawosi conducted all the key ceremonies in the cultivation calendar. So I won't go on, but there are lots of rituals concerning the offerings of food to the spirits. There was a sacred digging stick and the wizard who struck the soil, and they chanted magic spells over the soil too. So she talks about all the many different rituals around the world involving gardening and different ways of gardening. And it's an incredibly inspiring, lovely book about how gardens can help us in so many different aspects. And she is a great advocate of Voltaire's phrase, Il faut cultiver notre jardin. We must cultivate our gardens. As she says, in this era of virtual worlds and fake facts, the garden brings us back to reality. So that's a really lovely piece of non-fiction all about the joys of gardens. But I just want to mention a couple more novels while I have the chance, which also involve gardening in a particularly memorable way. So My Name is Leon by Kit Duvall is a really lovely book about a boy of 10 who is looking for someone to adopt him, in essence. And without going into the whole story, he also has a baby brother who does get adopted, and Leon is left waiting and wanting to be reunited with his brother. And while he's in this difficult situation and trying to be reunited and thinking about ways of escape and finding his brother, he stays with a foster carer, and the foster carer gives him a bicycle, which he then starts cycling around the streets where he's living, and he finds an allotment, and this allotment becomes, in a way, his savior, because he begins to go out of himself. He starts planting seeds, and he actually makes friends with some of the people on the allotment, one of whom is called Tufty. And Tufty starts giving him the seeds to plant. Leon begins to believe that he's going to have the best plot of vegetables and flowers in the whole of this allotment. And I'll just read you a little bit of it because it's so lovely. Tufty starts riffling through the seed box and picking out packets that he drops on the ground. Carrots for seeing at night, drop. Courgettes are soft to the bite, drop. Peas so sweet on your tongue, drop. And broccoli to keep you young, drop. Come, Star, look, here's tomato. What can you say about tomato? Tomato to make your sauce. Good, says Tufty and drops it on the ground and picks another packet. Now the hard bit. We got peppers next. What rhymes with sauce? Leon screws his eyes up. Peppers as big as a horse. So I love this book, which is full of the joys of gardening, and it actually really made me want to start gardening myself. I'm actually not a gardener, despite loving gardens in literature. I'm more of the kind of person who is described in this book near the beginning, who enjoys the destruction of gardening. Sue Stuart-Smith talks about the way that one of the most therapeutic things about gardening is actually getting the shears out and cutting the brambles down. And that's the kind of gardening that I can relate to. I wish I was that person who was growing seeds, but I haven't really got there yet. Another book I'd just like to briefly mention before I come to an end, and I'd love to know if any of you have got any last thoughts on gardens that you think I should be talking about. This lovely book, Diamond Star Halo by Tiffany Murray, is a book with a really fantastic garden where much of the action takes place. It's actually all set in a recording studio, which was a real recording studio, which really existed in Wales. I always forget the name, if it's Rockfort or Rock Guard. I'm going to have to write that down when I do a post at the end. And so the real recording studio is set in this farm in Wales, and all these amazing real singers came to the studio and wrote lots of their best music there in the incredible Welsh countryside. And it's an absolutely fecund book and story, all about creativity of every kind, particularly musical. So Queen famously went to this recording studio, and I think Bohemian Rhapsody actually has a scene in the real place or in a fictionalized version of it. But in the book, there's some really fantastic scenes in which the nascent pop stars are wandering around the garden, seeing ghosts, stumbling over nets, having inappropriate liaisons, and there's definitely sex in the rhubarb. There's something going on in the polytunnels, and it's a very funny book with a lot of really excellent, great garden scenes, which I highly recommend. So there's a lot of fantastic books there, which I really hope that you will enjoy reading. And I'll put a post at the end to remind you what the books are. And I'd just like to mention that there's going to be a wonderful literary salon on the 7th of August with Damien Barr. So look for details on this page, which is all about S.J. Watson's new novel, Final Cut. That's S.J. Watson, who wrote Before I Go to Sleep. So do come along for that and get your ticket. It's only £5. And S.J. Watson is a really excellent writer, and I'm dying to read the novel. Haven't had the chance yet. I'm very curious to know what that's going to be like. And My next salon here will be in a month's time. That will be August the 17th, I believe, on a Wednesday night. And the theme for that is going to be traveling through literature. I have been doing weekly salons on my Facebook page on every Wednesday night, but I'm going to have a break for the next couple of weeks. So the next one to come to will be the one here on Damien Barr's Literary Salon page. So come along for that in August. Thanks a lot for joining me tonight, and see you soon. Good night. Thanks for coming.